How do you use your Christian liberty? Our text today is taken from 1 Corinthians, the 8th chapter, and verses 1 through 13. Let's read this text together and see what this Paul is writing to the Corinthians about. Now about food sacrificed to idols. We know that we all possess knowledge, but knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know, but whoever loves God is known by God. Verse 4. So then about eating foods sacrificed to idols. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is one God. There is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods, small g, and many lords, small l, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, for whom all things came, and who made and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. But not everyone possesses this knowledge. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god, and since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and better if we do. Verse 9. Be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone with a weak conscience sees you with all your knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. When you sin against them in this way, and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall. Father in heaven, thank you so very much for your word. Your word is precious. Help us to understand it, that we can go out and represent you, Father, wherever we are, whether we're in a group, whether we're by ourselves at work or at the gas station, we can represent you. Because your word tells us how we're to live as your children. Thank you for it. We ask your blessings and understanding of your word as we go through it today. In Jesus' name, amen. Our sermon today and the one that we had last week are based on the book of 1 Corinthians. Wow, I mean, I'm amazed at the stuff that Paul brings out in these books. Paul was a heavy dude. Paul was a heavy man with a lot of responsibilities. God put those responsibilities on him. We've learned a lot about the Christians at Corinth already by what we learned last week. And as a way of review, I want to go through some of this, just reviewing what we kind of covered last week. Corinth was a major cosmopolitan city, a seaport, and a major trade center, the most important city in Achaia. It was filled with idolatry and immorality, pretty much like the society that Paul faced when he was in Rome. Remembering, Paul was the Gentile, was the apostle to the Gentile world. And Rome and Corinth were Gentile cities. You had the Jews who had some knowledge about God, and you had the Gentiles who had no knowledge about God, and they did what they wanted to do. And Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. That was a big task. Now, the church at Corinth largely was made up of Gentiles. Paul had established this church on his second missionary journey. However, after he had left that particular city after he had set it up, many old pagan customs, deeply rooted traditions began to creep back into the church, and Paul had to write letters to them, reminding them what Christ required of believers. And again, he addressed with them things such as divisions in the church and its leadership, the nature of a true apostle, and he was an apostle, so he had to tell him what their role was, his role was in the church. Dealing with a case of incest, we talked about that. They thought that was pretty good. He talked about that. Lawsuits among brothers, sexual immorality in the church, which they thought was okay. We talked about that last week. Instructions on Christian marriage, instructions concerning changes in status, concerning the unmarried. Just leave the unmarried people alone. Leave them alone. They don't have to be married. You don't have to give them all kinds of stuff saying they got to be married. You know, let them be like I am. They're good folks. They can serve me more. He had to tell them about them, remind them about those things. And concerning food sacrificed to idols. That brings us to our topic today, our text today. Now, this particular problem that the Corinthian Christians were facing was the eating of meats that had been sacrificed to idols. These Christians at Corinth were continually confronted with this problem. Such meat could appear on nearly any table at any time. Now, let's give you a little background on that. The meat offered on the pagan altar was usually divided into three portions. One portion was burned up, which was the sacrifice to God. The second portion was given to the priest, and the third portion was given to the offerer. So the person who made the offering got a third of it. If the priest did not use their portion, then it was taken to the meat market. Thus, a considerable amount of sacrificial meat ended up in the public meat market or on the table of pagan neighbors and friends or at the pagan festivals. The problem the Corinthians faced was obvious. Was the meat they were eating spiritually contaminated? Did the pagans' gods actually have an effect on the meat? Even if one did not think so, what would his participation do to his Christian brothers who might have doubted about whether to eat it or not? Can you guys hear me? Am I loud enough? Paul's conclusion was this: live your testimony with loving concern for your brother, but do not make an issue of the meat sold in the market. Eat it as a gift from God. People would sit out at a table. It was very common to eat meat, whether with their friends, with their neighbors, their relatives, or other members of the church. And they just weren't sure where this meat was coming from. Paul said, eat it as if it was a gift from God. Do this except when the point is explicitly made that the meat was offered to an idol. In such a case, it would seem that you are participating in this religious practice. Refrain then for your weaker brother's sake and for your own peace of mind. Above all, do everything to the glory of God. That's what he was teaching them. Does that make sense? Are you getting this? Unless it was specifically said, as you sit down and eat, well, you know, this meat was offered to this God, don't eat it. Okay? Because it's offered to a God. But if nobody says it, don't worry about it. Sit down and have yourself a good old meal. Okay? Act as if it's a blessing from God, a gift from God. We know about idols. They are nothing. We'll talk about that just a little later. Paul's answer leads to a discussion of the larger question of how a believer should use his Christian liberty. Paul lays down the principle that love for one's brother in Christ should be the motivating factor in contemplating one's Christian liberty. Now, in verse 1 of our text here today, Paul starts out in our text by saying, now about food sacrificed to idols. Okay, we know that we all possess knowledge. And I was looking at the structure of that sentence there. Did you see that after idols there's a semicolon? There's a semicolon there. It says, now about food offered to idols, semicolon. We know that we all possess knowledge. They're related. We all possess knowledge. But knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Now, knowledge was a great value to the Corinthians, and Paul agreed with the importance and exercise of knowledge. But the Corinthians tried to solve their problems with knowledge and reason. Paul made it clear that knowledge must be tempered with love, just like Miss Fleming said. What's her first name? Michelle Fleming said. She talked about love, 1 Corinthians 13. Everything that the Christian should do has got to be tempered with love. Everything. When you go to the gas station, it's got to be tempered with love when you meet people, when you're at the grocery store. Love is all-encompassing. When Mel and I play ping pong, I got to get him back out on the ping pong table. We haven't played for a year. We have to have a certain amount of love in the way we act with each other and those other guys that come and play with us. The praise team, when you're up here singing, you have to work together in love. That's the common denominator of all Christian activity. So Paul made it clear, knowledge must be tempered with love. Knowledge does puff up. Knowledge can give a person a big head. Knowledge by itself has limitations. It says in, let me read, start at verse 1 again. Now, about food sacrificed to our idols. We know that we all possess knowledge, but knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. Verse 3, but whoever loves God is known by God. Knowledge does puff up. Knowledge can give a person the big head. Knowledge by itself has limitations. No matter how much a man thinks he knows, he still does not have full knowledge. No man has full and complete knowledge. What really matters is not our knowledge, but God's knowledge. And God does share his true knowledge with us. For John 17:17 says, sanctify them by thy truth. Thy word is true. And the person who truly loves God is the one who is open to God's knowledge. He is the one who God gives wisdom, understanding. Now, about food sacrificed to idols, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Well, what do you mean? Love is patient. We're talking about when dealing now with these people and this subject of meat and stuff sacrificed to idol. Love is patient. Love is understanding. Love is considerate. Love is humble, self-suffering, willing to sacrifice for the sake of someone else. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, verse 4. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one, Paul is telling them. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many small g gods and many small l lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, for whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, who is Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. We know this. You understood this when I first came through and baptized you guys. You accepted God as the God of all, the creator of God, and you accepted Jesus Christ as the Lord, through whom all things came, and the very reason we're living. You understood that. And yes, there are many small g gods and many small l lords that were a part of the Corinthian history. And Paul acknowledges that in verses 5 and 6. Now, I want to read you something. You don't have to turn there. But I'm going to read you Acts 17:22 through 23 from the King James translation. You remember this. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, that is of Athens, Rome, that was one of the cities that he was commissioned to, a Gentile place, just like Corinth. Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, or beheld your worshipings, I found an altar with the inscription, To the unknown God, whom you therefore ignorantly worshipped. Paul said that right to their face. You were ignorantly worshiping this God. Here are some of the gods they worshipped. There was Ares, who was the god of war. There was Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. So if they went hunting, they would pray to Artemis so that they could be successful and have a big catch. There was Apollo, the god of music, art, and knowledge. Knowledge was a big thing for these people. There was Dionysus, the god of wine, fruitfulness, and plenty. There was Aphrodite, the goddess of love and pleasure. We talked about Aphrodite last week. Even in the churches, pleasure. They worship this God of love. Yeah, with the prophetess. There was also the unknown God. They had built an altar to the unknown God for fear of missing out on blessings or receiving punishment. This was the just in case God. This was the catch-all God. Just in case we left somebody out, we want you to be pleased. So they sacrificed to that God. Now, Paul was not the only man of God facing the challenge of pagan gods and teaching the people that there was only one God. Johnny's going to read something for us. Would you, can I have the microphone?
You can just
Okay.
grab that.
I'm going to ask her to read something for us.
Can I just sit here? Or
Yeah,
can I
yeah,
stand?
you can sit there.
Turn it on. First Kings chapter 18, verses 20 through 39 is what Al has asked me to read. So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people answered, "It is well spoken." Then Elisha said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose for yourselves 1 bull, and prepare it first, for you are many. And call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it." And they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened." And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he made a trench about the altar, as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order, and cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it again, a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God."
Thank you, Johnny. So Paul was not the only one faced with trying to show God's people that there is only one God. There were many gods back then. And you see what the people went through to prove that their God was a God, but their God never came through. My point here, the pagan gods can do nothing. The pagan gods can do nothing. They are powerless. Verse 7 of our text, 1 Corinthians 8, verse 7, it says, but not everyone possesses this knowledge. Now, Paul is talking to the Christians there. Not everyone possesses this knowledge. But not all Christians, they are not fully aware of these principles. And then he goes on in the second part of verse 7. It says, some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. Some Christians can't, and in that day they couldn't tear themselves away from the idea that sacrificial food is okay to eat. It says, their conscience is weak. Their conscience is defiled, or they're made to feel guilty. Some people right among you, they feel guilty. It goes on to in verse 8 and says, but food does not bring us near to God. We are not worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. So this food, or meat, that had been sold at the meat market, or that's on the table of a friend or neighbor, there is no need to worry about or to be concerned as to whether or not it was offered to an idol or not. That's for the mature Christian. They understand that. Because, he says again in verse 8, but food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we don't eat. It's a mood issue. Sit down and eat it as if it was a gift from God. But again, you do have those among you who are weak in their conscience. Now, verse 9 here is where Christian liberty comes in. Verse 9, 1 Corinthians 7. Be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone with a weak conscience sees you with all your knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be embodied or emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. We want to realize that he is saying, we don't want this to become a stumbling block. This right that we have, this right to eat, we don't want this to become a stumbling block to them. They have weak consciences. Now, it talks also about it, as you walk into the temple of the idols. Well, why would a Christian be walking in the temple of the temple of the idols? I couldn't quite figure that out. But then I realized that back in that society, there was kind of like open temples or open environment where you could just walk up and down the street. As Paul said, he strolled through Athens, and if you wanted to sit out here, you could sit out here. Maybe this was part of a temple, but you could have a meal, or you could have fellowship, kind of like what, a Starbucks? You don't have to do everything in Starbucks. So, they could do that. But if you should happen to be in one of these places and you decided you wanted to have a meal, don't you be concerned about the meat there. just go ahead and eat it. I want to share something here with you. Though Christians have the authority to eat or not to eat, they must be careful lest through the exercise of this authority or this freedom to act in a free way, they somehow cause the weak in conscience to stumble in living their Christian lives. By stumbling blocks is meant causing the weak brother not only to have a sense of guilt, but to go beyond this into sin by compromising with the pagan idolatry. Does that make sense? Because of his weak conscience. Suppose, and then Paul gives us an example here. Suppose a brother who is weak in conscience sees you, who understands that an idol is nothing, reclining at the table to eat in an idol temple. I told you how they might be in an idol temple. Won't he also be encouraged to eat and so do what his conscience forbids him to do? When you do such a thing, you are using your freedom and knowledge to bring your weak brother down the path toward spiritual weakness and destruction. Now, he makes a clarifying statement here. He says, Paul does not mean utterly spiritual destruction, for he calls this man a brother for whom Christ died. You are weakening the faith and ruining the Christian life of the brother. Speaking to the strong brother now, the one who has no problems with this, Paul is saying, you are the cause of the weak brother to stumble into sin. You yourselves are sinning in a twofold way. Number one, against your brother, and number two, against Christ, and that you are wounding the conscience of those who belong to Christ. So this is a very serious situation. You don't want to offend. Everything is about love, just like Michelle Fleming was saying. Everything, you do everything as a Christian through love. Now, I want to leave you with an example of this principle. Every year, Marilyn, Johnny, Sharon go to Connecting and Bonding. That's an organization that's set up by a lady in the church, Janice May. You know that. The wives of the pastors get a chance to go spend some time, 3-4 days with Janice and a group of ladies in that general region. And they talk about things that they have problems maybe discussing in the local areas, but things that pastors' wives have in general. Some pastors' wives live in rural areas, and they just not many people to talk with, and they have frustration, so they get together once a year, and they talk about those things. And it's open to the pastors' wives in that general region. They can all go if they like. But Denise, over the last few years, have invited a lot of other denominations to come in, for those pastors' wives to come in. And they have different beliefs. They have the Methodists, they have the Baptists, they have the Holiness, Apostolic. A lot of those wives come into that meeting. And you have to be careful because you can offend some of them. I'm going to have Marilyn stand up and tell you one principle that Denise has outlined. Denise has outlined for them.
Usually when we stay in a hotel, the Embassy Suites, and they have a cocktail hour that starts at 5 o'clock. And of course, we ladies love to go and get our drinks. But when we have a group of ladies that are with us that are not of our denomination, Janice has asked us not to do that. If we do want to get drinks, we kind of get them discreetly, take them to our rooms, and we can have it later when we're not around them. Normally, we just bring our drinks to dinner, and we have it with dinner and enjoy ourselves and the rest of the day. But when there are people in situations like that, so as not to offend or to harm the conscience of another person, Janice has implemented the fact that we should, if we get drinks, we don't have to, but if you do, take it quietly to your room and enjoy it later. So that is so as to not offend. And I'm going to add one other thing with my mom. We know our church tradition, and with eating pork, when we have my mother over, we go out to dinner. Even though it's okay to eat what we want, we make sure we do not, as to not offend her. So that's kind of what he's saying.
Thank you. These Christians, these other Christians are people that Christ died for. They're very sincere people. They love Christ. Christ loved them. But you know, you can wound their consciences by our freedom, by what we understand is okay. It might not be okay in their religion. So we don't want to wound one of those people that Christ died for. In conclusion, verse 13, Paul says, "Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall." That is so important. If we are around a group of God's people that he is working with and dealing with, and they don't imbibe in drinks, or they don't imbibe in certain meats, if
Playing cards.
well, but playing cards is another thing. If I don't have to have another drink as long as I live, it's worth it. That's the principle here. How do we use our Christian freedom? Is that the sermon? How do you use your Christian liberty? It's all the same. It's all the same. Now, we want to transition into communion. We understand that